can use. All right, can you hear me all right? Okay, well, thank you for that introduction, and I also want to thank the Society for inviting me. Thank you. Thank the Society for inviting me, and I particularly want to thank Teresa Steininger for persevering and making this, working out the details for this trip, which wasn't easy. We were sharing expenses with Trinity College in Dublin, where I just came from. Anyway, and thank you for coming. This talk is about changing false beliefs, and in particular, it's a very personal thing. It's about changing my false beliefs and all kinds of other people who believe the same thing I did at the time that I was starting out. And I'm giving you two examples. And of course, in doing experiments, you learn something every day, and often your beliefs are challenged. But the two examples I want to talk about were kind of involve sort of a sea change of thinking and what it is that economists believe, at least for a fairly large number of us. Okay, I'm not saying that everyone's on board yet, but and I want to talk also about the implications for these experiments for the broader economy. I'm going to relate this somewhat to what we usually talk about when we study macroeconomics. So the theme here is that widely held beliefs can be wrong, they can be substantially wrong. And there are many examples in science, not only in social science, where experiments gradually enable false beliefs to be changed. And for example, in physics, I should mention something about the difference between experiments in physical science and social science. In the physical sciences, replication is actually much less important. And the reason is that in science experiments, physics and astronomy, what is very important is the precision of the experiment, the adjustments of all the instruments. The way you control error is to control measurement in the design of the experiment. And you don't have to, if people see the design and are satisfied with the precision, they tend to believe the results. Or at least eventually they can be persuaded to believe the results. Okay, there may be a lot of conflict at first. So, now the famous Michaelson moral experiment, which was 1887, actually Michaelson had done the same experiment 2 or 3 years earlier in Berlin. And he already had, in that experiment, couldn't find evidence for the notion of an absolute space. But he believed that the basic problem was that the precision of the experiment was not adequate. So he teamed up with Morley at Cleveland in 1887 and repeated the experiment, but under much more precise controls. And the experiments clearly showed absolutely no evidence for this thing that people thought existed, the notion of absolute space. And that linked up very much to Einstein's work. He didn't need the concept of absolute space, of course. And so the combination of that change in theory and that evidence really started to make a sea change in what people believed in physics. And then again, Eddington, in 1919, his famous solar eclipse experiments were designed. The prediction of Einstein was that when light from a distant star passes a massive gravity, a very massive body like the sun, it will be bent. actually would be bent under Newton, but not as much as under Einstein. So there was a clearly a different prediction that Einstein was making over Isaac Newton, and you needed to photograph. You had to make at each of the various telescope locations. You had to make two plates, a night plate and a day plate. Okay, the night plate showed you the position of the stars where in the area that were going to be photographed during the solar eclipse. And the idea was that there would be an apparent shift outwards of the position of the stars that were close to the edge of the sun. In other words, they would appear to be shifted out because of the bending of the light. And so two of his three telescope locations were consistent with Einstein, and the other one was closer to Newton. Of course, the Newtonians thought that's the one you should count. And but he was able to show that there was a problem in the adjustment, or in the focus, in the one telescope setting, both at night and the daytime. So he was able to kind of convince people that the two he should count were the ones that were consistent with Einstein. So I want to now move to two examples that illustrate the sea change in how we thought about economics that were falsified by experiments. First is the false beliefs about knowledge of markets. And the introductory slide actually gave you some of this. And so I'm going to go over that a little more slowly here. But see, the claim that market equilibrium required complete information or perfect information on supply and demand had its origin in Jevons. And also, when we taught economics in those days, we not only told a perfect information story, but we also told a story about large numbers, and everybody had to be a price taker. And in teaching principles, I found that sort of embarrassing, because obviously people can't have complete information. So why are we spending so much time talking about supply and demand? And not that I didn't believe it. And in fact, I did not believe, I was really shocked that the results of the experiments tended to be contrary to that theory. And here's the quotation from William Stanley Jevons in 1871. A market is theoretically perfect only when all traders have perfect knowledge of the conditions of supply and demand and the constant ratio of exchange, in other words, the price. Why did Jevons believe that? I think he believed it because he had to have complete information. In the model, you see, he needed this notion of full information on supply and demand in order to see what the clearing price and the corresponding clearing quantity was. And he didn't really have a notion of how real people in a real market might actually discover that equilibrium if they could do it at all. It was just not a question that was asked. Okay, so that's what led me into the experiments. Okay, in the experiments I'm going to talk about, we use the two-sided bid-ask market as the institution for exchange. And it's important to understand that each of the participants in the market is either a buyer or a seller, and that participant only has a small fragment of the total demand or the total supply. He has the only information on his own willingness to pay if he or she is a buyer, or willingness to accept if he or she is a seller. That's private, secret, separated, dispersed information. Okay? And then the particular institution that I chose was the kind of open outcry two-sided auction that you found in the commodity pits in Chicago, the Chicago Board of Trade and the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, and also in the New York Stock Exchange with trading stocks. And my thought was that, look, if there's anywhere in the world a competitive market, it's surely there in Chicago or New York. So if you're going to falsify this theory, because I didn't believe it, okay, that you could the notion that you could get there without complete information, if you're going to shoot that down, then you give it a best shot and take the market you think is most competitive. Then you have a more powerful result. Well, we were wrong. Contract prices converged really quite quickly. And moreover, this gradually over the years was very widely replicated. It's certainly been done, I'm sure, thousands of times by now in teaching exercises and everything. Now, by the way, this started out as a teaching exercise with me and became a research project. But the exciting thing about doing experiments is that the professor learns also along with the students, because you're nearly always, when you do variations on experiments, you learn new things. So it makes the whole enterprise. I often say that if you're not learning, you're not teaching. And this is a good mechanism to see to do that with. All right, now here's a recent experiment. These actually happen to be high school students. They're great subjects. They really get in. And this is an oral outcry, two-sided auction. Okay. But someone is entering bids and asks into a computer, and that's why I'm able to display this. In fact, the bids and asks are displayed on the screen in real time as people announce them, and they are typed. Notice here that up here, let's see if I can get the light to work. Well, up here on the right, you'll see that in the order in which they occur, you see a matching of a buyer with a seller, a buyer number and a seller number, and they're matched at a trade for a single unit at $6. Now that buyer has a value, its own private value that the experimenter has given him, and that value is more than the $6. And that buyer is motivated in a real experiment when we pay money. That buyer gets the difference between the value, for example, it might be $8, and the $6 that he pays in the market for. So that buyer is motivated to buy low. The lower the better. Similarly, on the sell side, that seller has a cost or value that he's been given. And he doesn't sell it. Think of it this way: if you don't sell it, you don't incur the cost. Or you can also think of it: if you've already owned it, you'd rather keep it rather than sell it. But anyway, the point is, his costs are less than the $6, and that person, she earns the difference between the price that she sells in the market and that value. Okay, so she's motivated to try to sell high. And so that's the way that works. And then, and you'll see over here, the blue are the bids and the red are the asks. And you have bid, ask, bid, ask. It comes down, and the bid-ask spread narrows. At some point, a buyer accepts the ask, and you have a contract, or a seller accepts the buyer's bid, and it's a contract. So they can come from either side. And what you see here is the line here. That black line is connecting all of the contracts in the order in which they occur. And then the next slide superimposes the supply and demand that was in operation in that market. And there were a total of let's see, there was 12, I'm sorry, I think 12. And they have each has 4 units, okay? So the units traded are shown here on the left, and then the higher cost units, the lower value units that weren't low enough or high enough to find a trading partner on the other side, those units are not bought or sold. So and now notice here that the supply and demand is symmetric. The prices are converging from below. That's something we've learned in these markets. In a symmetric supply and demand, the prices on average tend to start below the equilibrium and converge to the equilibrium from below. In other words, almost universally, buyers do better than sellers. Almost no one believes that. The typical buyer in the market thinks he's being screwed over by the seller. Okay? But this is, in fact, buyers are very good at taking care of themselves. We see that demonstrated over and over again. All right, now here's the first experiment I did, which thank you for displaying. This is the first experiment I did in January 1956. It was a class with 22 people. I took 11 of them and made them buyers, and 11 of them made sellers. I gave them little cards. Each was a trader of at most 1 unit. Okay? And I repeated it in a series of time market periods, period 1, 2, and so on. And I was astounded by these results. I thought there must be something wrong with the experiment. And I thought, indeed, there is something wrong with the experiment. The symmetry of supply and demand. Notice the average value, the average cost, and the equilibrium price are all the same. I thought that was the flaw. So then I started to do experiments with other environments. And here's a very asymmetric one in which most of the surplus, most of the profit here goes to the sellers and not to the buyers. It could be the other way around. And it converges, you see, from below. It takes a little longer, but it does converge. So the neat thing about this, my own notions as to why I was getting these results could be tested, and I could test my own attempt to defend the standard way of thinking. And finally, it was clear I had to change my thinking. And the problem then was to convince other people, because no one was doing experiments. What's that? It's not economics, you see. Why is it not economics? Because no one was doing it. Economics is what economists do, okay? Not some guy out of Purdue University who just gotten hired as a young assistant professor. All right. So this was just inexplicable to see by the way we were thought in the 1950s and 60s. And this led, economists had not thought in terms of articulating a message space and a contract procedure and the notion of people in the market learning from successive contracts. And I remember when I started to give talks about this, I would encounter all sorts of questions and objections. Game theorists, let me back up here. Game theorists, like in this chart here, they would say, well, now, you've plotted the contracts in sequence. Now, are those spread out over time, or are they all bunched up at the end? I said, no, they're not bunched up at the end. Tend to be, someone gets in there and trades fairly soon. They were astonished by that. No one has any information, so it's optimal to wait. Everybody should just wait till the end and crowd. You crowd in yourself. So that all those, these were the kinds of ways that people thought about things at the time. Now, by the way, Adam Smith wouldn't have had any trouble with this. Why? What's the basic axiom in Adam Smith's theory of morals, not theory of moral sense, I'm getting ahead of myself, The Wealth of Nations. What's the fundamental axiom? The propensity to truck, barter, and exchange. He says that's built in. In the theory of moral sentiments, he talked about human sociability. They were very, very social creature, and he saw markets as a simple extension of its sociability. Okay? And he says, we don't know why humans are like that, but they trade. So he began with that. He didn't begin with resources, preferences, technology, and then markets that aggregated that information the way we commonly then, and I think even today, still teach economics. No. He would not see that as the way to go. He would say the way to start is what people do. And they trade. What happens when they trade? You start to get prices. Other people learn about the prices. If they're not public, they learn about it by gossip. Gossip is older than trade or markets, very old. You learn about it. And as soon as there's a price out there and you are growing corn and hogs, you can make a calculation. And you could say, should I be growing a little bit more corn and fewer hogs? So you can start now to think about it. So the prices help you in calculation. That's the way he would have thought about it. Somehow, by the time we get 100 years later to William Stanley Jevons, that has been lost. But I think we're getting back to it now in full bloom. Okay. Now, from this beginning, here at the bottom, we went on, and new experiments started to vary information. For example, one of the things I did, I said, well, let's give people complete information. Let's show them what the supply and demand is before they start trading. Well, it's very easy to design experiments where it takes them longer to reach the equilibrium with perfect information than with incomplete. Because if people have complete information, they can think of better things to try to do than to go to competitive equilibrium, and they try to do it. Okay? It's pretty obvious that if it's very asymmetric, and most of the surplus is going to the sellers, most of the profit, buyers will resist that. Whereas if they don't know it, they'll go ahead and trade. So actually, complete information, you see, you can show slows down. They still converge, but it'll take longer. And then we got into other forms of message contract procedures. For example, sealed bid and offer mechanisms, and later auctions, all kinds of one-sided as well as two-sided auctions. And posted offer pricing, like in ordinary retail markets, you go in and there's the price, take it or leave it. And, well, sellers make mistakes when they post take it or leave it prices. So what happens in the stores? They have an end-of-the-month clearance sale. Well, they have some way of correcting their mistakes. They pin some other institution to that. So they get it fixed out because they're leaving money on the table. Sears Roebuck, Montgomery Ward used to publish a catalog of prices. They make mistakes, so then they have a spring clearance catalog where they get the prices right, especially on the stuff that they price too high, and they clear it out. So all of those things we began to study. We studied, we varied the numbers of participants in the market, firm sizes, and so on. And then also very exciting was application to real-world design in new markets. My original undergraduate work had been done in physics and electrical engineering, and I had an opportunity to return to that because there was interest in the question of how you would organize a market, if you did it all and if you could, a market for electric power on a high voltage grid. A wholesale market. And we started in the mid-80s to develop experiments in the lab dealing with that. And we found that people in a multi-node network, these were computer-assisted markets, could converge over time on on prices, node by node, which cleared that market. So the supply and demand was now working in a much richer and more complex markets. And some of those networks were really quite, even though we started simple, they eventually became quite complex. And that took me and also my colleague Stephen Rusanti, whose background is in systems engineering, and took us to Australia and New Zealand, and we were involved in the liberalization of the power industry there. And the critical thing that the experiments did was to prove feasibility. Because all kinds of people believed that there was no way you could organize the electric power industry around the market. So we took these people, and these were industry people, they were government people, put them in experiments. They produced the equilibrium. They worked just fine. They have to tell us what's wrong with the experiment. Okay? And maybe there are things that are wrong with the experiment, because you have a bunch of stuff with practitioners in the world. Well, that got, the Australians got into that really big time, and within 4 years after we were there, they were already trading power on a whole high-voltage network in the southeastern part of Australia, because that's where the network is, where the population is. Okay, now, let me point out that these goods that we're talking about so far are non-durables. Remember, before you go to market in the experiment, you already know whether you're a buyer or whether you're a seller. There's no retrading. Okay, all sales are final, and it's over as soon as you buy it. You don't switch roles because of a change in price. Okay? Well, that's characteristic of non-durable or perishable goods. They're not retraded. Hamburgers, haircuts, hotel space. The seat you buy on an airplane. Okay? You don't buy that to resell it, you buy it to use it. Okay? And so we're talking about markets of that type, and they're very large. If you subtract government spending from GDP, call that private product, then consumer non-durables are 75% of that. It's by far the largest single item in the macro accounts. Now, durables are different. Assets don't behave the same. We didn't know this when we started to do it. In fact, I expected everything in that theory to work, which was that the false belief that transparency and asset value will prevent price bubbles. If you have a transparent market, people know what the fundamental value is, and they won't bubble. That was wrong, wrong, wrong. So we studied asset environments with complete information on our asset value, and I'll show you how that works in a moment. And our whole idea was that we would create a baseline where everything would behave itself, people would trade the fundamental value, and then we would see if we could create bubbles by doing variations on that information, see if we could jumpstart bubbles. So we needed that baseline, but we didn't know really how little we knew. And the first experiments were already bubbling. Here's an example of that environment, which we thought was transparent. We gave people endowments of cash and shares. For example, here's a typical portfolio here with each type of trader. And if we have 15 people in the experiment, then we'd do 5 people with 1 unit and 945 cash, 5 people had 2, and a smaller amount of cash, and so on. So that was the environment that we created. And then at the end of each period, a dividend, a yield is declared on that asset. And that whatever that outcome of that draw is paid in cash into your account, okay, along with whatever shares you have. So if you have 3 shares, you get 3 times whatever the dividend rate is, and that cash is added to whatever your cash holdings are in your account, and you go on to the next period. Okay, and it starts out, and we're looking at the expected value is 24 cents per period. So in period 1, you're trading something that's looking forward to 15 draws. Okay, so what's the fundamental value? It's 15 times 24, $3.60. We explain that to all the subjects. Well, the first experiment we were getting getting a big deviation from that, and I thought, what's going on here? You know, they don't understand. They're having some difficulty. So I said, henceforth, let's only recruit people. This is the original 1988 paper that we published in Econometrica. Thenceforth, all experiments that we report in that paper, we recruited only subjects that had been in a previous supply and demand bid-ask market. So they were already experienced as to how the trading took place. Okay, and we also, at the end of each period here, we reminded people, okay, in the next period, the fundamental holding value is, there's 10 periods left of trading, so it's 10 times 24 cents is $2.40. So we just really leaned on them. They paid no attention at all to that information. If you think people are anxious to know what the experimenter wants them to do, this really shoots that down. Okay? Here's the very first, we finally started reporting, okay, our experiments after we made those changes in recruitment. And here's the declining fundamental value, and here's the mean price, 7 trades, and the mean price way below that fundamental value, and then 9 trades a little higher, 12, and so on. And the prices gradually grow and shoot and rise above the declining fundamental value, and then they crash sometime between there and the midpoint and the end, somewhere in there, sometimes only at the very end. So that's inexperienced traders. Here is the purple line, are the same people who were in the first experiment brought back a few days later, and they're in the same experiment, okay? They read the same instructions. And now prices are higher, and volume tends to be lower, but they're still, and it crashes early. And then the third time, it's still closer to fundamental value, and there's a whole period here from period 04, 5, 6, 7 where there's no trade at all. Where there's just simply the bid-ask spread comes together and finally, and the period's over and no one's traded. Don't leave. Modeling bubbles. There's a mathematician, Dundas Kachel, at the University of Pittsburgh, who had a model of bubbles, and he needed fundamental value. But out there in the world, it's hard to find cases where people know what the fundamental value is. And so he was ecstatic when he discovered we were doing an experiment. So we got together and started to do some work together. And Dundas, his model postulated 2 kinds of traders. Fundamentalists. The fundamentalists buy in proportion to the discount from fundamental value, and they sell in proportion to the premium. Okay? And then the other type of trader is a momentum trader, and he or she just buys in proportion to the rate of change in price. So if the rate of change in price is positive, he or she is buying. If it's rising, if it's growing faster, then he buys more. And if it turns negative, he starts to sell. Okay? Well, you can show with that model that if you increase cash holdings, the amount of cash in the system, you'll get a bigger bubble. And the reason is the guys that run out of money are the momentum buyers, the momentum traders, not the fundamentals. Okay? They're selling if it's above equilibrium, not buying. So if it goes to higher and higher prices, it's coming from the momentum guys. And if you give them more money, they'll bid it higher. Well, here's market in which the cash holdings is half the value of the shareholdings. And these are plotted as deviations from the equilibrium, so it's still a declining fundamental value. It's just that we're doing it in terms of deviations, so it's really the same chart. And this is 4 experiments, and we're looking at the mean price in period 1 across 4 independent replications, mean price in period 2, and so on. Well, here then is another 4 experiments with the amount of cash equal to the amount of shares that they hold. And here's a third groups that, I'm sorry, the second one is their cash is 75% of their share values. And the last one, it's the amount of cash they have is equal. So more cash, bigger bubbles. Now, this is probably hard for you to see, but this is Lahav has published a really interesting article in the Journal of Behavioral Finance, and what he's doing is very long horizon bubbles. Instead of 15 periods, there are 200. And it's not continuous bid-ask. What it is, everybody puts in a PQ to buy and a PQ to sell. Price, say you're most willing to pay, and this many units, and the amount or the amount most you're willing, or the least amount that you want to take if you're selling, and your offer in quantity. And then those bids are just arrayed from highest to lowest and asked from lowest to highest, and they're clear. And that goes real fast. Okay, so he's able to get 200. But look at this stuff. You'll take this lower one. Here's a group in the lower left. It starts out and falls, then it moves up, and it's a big bubble. It crashes back to fundamental value and then goes up again. There's nothing happening. There's no new information coming in. They're just getting these draws. They're just doing something. Within themselves, they're igniting these bubbles. Okay, you can't blame them on anyone or anything outside of them. They're doing it. Okay, as Pogo once said, the famous comic strip character, "We have met the enemy, and he is us." Okay, and now I want to say something here about how these relate to the economy, and this is from a book that I did with my colleague Steve Gierstad at Chapman on rethinking housing bubbles. Okay, here's some macro account expenditures plotted as deviations from the 4th quarter of 2007, which was when the Great Recession officially began. And so everything is plotted as deviations, percentage deviations from that. Notice that C here, capital C, is non-durable consumer goods. Remember, that's our by far the largest component in the macro accounts. That's being plotted here, along with GDP, the red line. Okay, notice they're tracking each other very carefully, very closely, up to the 4th quarter. Then GDP falls, consumption actually continues to rise a little bit modestly, and then it finally turns around and dips, but not as much as GDP does. Consumption, non-durable consumption, is very, very reliable. It holds up extremely well in almost all recessions. And just as in the lab, people discover prices in the markets very well, similarly out there in the world, those are very, very stable markets. And what stability the economy has comes from those kinds of goods and services. All the trouble is in the others, okay? The stuff that you can retrade. That's where the trouble comes. And instability comes from retradability. Think of it that way. That's what the experiments show, and I think it's very clear that that's true in the macro accounts. D, the green line, is durable consumer goods. That's mostly automobiles, but also furniture and hard goods that, you know, have a life. Then the durable life. And then the purple line is business investment. And then the red is housing. Okay, by far the most durable good. You buy those, they last, what, about 100 years. And also, you buy them mostly with other people's money. Okay, that's a big difference from with these other things. And you'll notice here, these are expenditures, quarterly expenditures on new housing, rising, peaked out in early 2006 and fell for 9 straight quarters. Lots of lead time for the recession. And then crashed clear down and bottomed out here in 2009. And of course, those housing prices are falling against household debt, fixed debt, and immediately balance sheets are slammed. Households are already have very quickly have damaged balance sheets. Here's housing expenditures as a percentage of GDP going back to 1920. Okay, and you can see here's the Great Depression. Here is 1930 to 1934, and notice here that for 3 to 4 years before 1929, we have housing expenditures falling relative to GDP, and actually for 3 years it fell absolutely, not only relative to GDP, but they were falling a lot, absolutely, and then continued to crash, bottoming out here in 1934, and then turned around. So that's one bookend. The other big one is the Great Recession here on the right, and you'll notice here the long declining level of new expenditures for new homes, and finally comes the Great Recession, started in 2007. And then in between, in the gray vertical bars, are all the recessions in between. And housing is commonly the culprit in the sense that 11, you see, of the last 14 recessions are preceded by decline in new housing expenditures. If you look at, often the turn down though in housing looks like a false signal. Look here in the early 50s, we have a big decline in housing, but a recession didn't come right away. What took up the slack? Korean War expenditures. Okay, they were picking up the slack. If balance sheets are all in pretty good shape, you don't have a lot of damaged balance sheets around, then it is the case that if one category of spending falls, you can make that up with another category of spending. And that's clearly happened here. And so the recession, it did come, but it was delayed. And then the other one involved the Vietnam War, because there you had a crash in housing, but at the time there was a buildup of expenditures for the Vietnam War, and that offset it until finally early 70s we had another turn down in the recession, and the recession came. So that, I think, is sort of the learning from that. And this is the same chart, or a similar chart, but on a log scale, and it shows at the top GDP rising at over 3%, fairly steady growth, except for the Depression and the very end, the Great Recession. There's a turn down. Okay, and notice that consumption, non-durables, is up there, a substantial fraction of that, and notice it has even less wiggles in it than GDP. It's very steady. Okay, all of the volatility is coming in things like housing, the bottom chart, okay, on a log scale, and in between we took durables and housing, added them, and put those in. They're not, the two together are not quite as volatile as housing, But all of the trouble, you see, comes from the things that you can retrade. Okay, here's a, so what we learned was that these markets for perishables are incredibly efficient. People are very good at finding the equilibrium in those kinds of markets. And that turned us away then from focusing only on equilibrium and trying to investigate discovery processes in markets and how institutions play into that. Kind of changed kind of what experimentalists did in the way they thought about markets. And then we discovered, without intending to or believing that we would, that asset markets that involve retradables behave very differently than the first class of the markets. And we find all sorts of parallels between that experimental work and what we find out there in the world, and in particular with regard to housing markets. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you.